forward in this journey of what we're going to do tonight. And this is the roadmap for tonight. The kind of things we're going to briefly talk about the risk factors, very briefly, then lead into, not too technical, right? A couple of models of suicidal behavior, talk about prevention strategies, and then very specifically hone in on the social factors and what we know related to youth suicide. Gosh, I wouldn't have my presentation without at least a couple statistics. Sorry, this will be the only graph you'll see. But this is to highlight how from 2011 to 2020, if you look at this bottom blue graph, historically, this has been fairly flat, right? The youth suicide rate, the 15 to 24, right? The adolescent and young adult or transitional age kids has been pretty flat, but it increased over the years, right? And then flattened out a little bit and took a little bit of a dip around 2019, and then leading to another slight increase in 2020, which was the year of your pandemic. So moving on, right? So what do we know? Not going to spend a lot of real specific time on this. Broad, if you want to be reductionistic, if you want to look at one single most important factor, we know it's a prior suicide attempt as a predictor of suicide deaths, but we know it's much more complicated than this. And this is just a brief summary of some, but we know, again, it's much more complicated, and we'll talk about some of those in general, right? The large groups or domains of those areas involve, starting broadly, the health systems and society, which includes things like, about access, the availability of means of suicide, the exposure or the reporting in the media, especially inappropriate and sensationalistic reporting of suicide deaths in the media, and then the domain of stigma for individuals in seeking generally mental health and substance use treatment, but also help for suicidal thoughts and behaviors. On the community and relationship side, we know all these variables, right? Trauma, war, acculturation, discrimination, the sense of isolation, which we're going to really address a little bit more afterwards, right? And a few others. And then the individual factors, right? For many years, way back when I trained up at Columbia with David Schaffer and others, it was a focus on the psychological autopsy and the psychiatric risk factors, which we know are still important, but we know it's not just that, right? We know it has to do with things like loss, health issues, like especially in the elderly with chronic pain, and then the family history, right, of someone who has taken their lives. But within this mix of many different factors, we know that relationship issues are a big factor, right? Notice we're not talking about etiology, we're talking about factors. And so we know that social, relationship, interpersonal, and ultimately individual issues are involved in addition to these more ecologic or external factors. So what about the pandemic, right? We get this a lot of time. Well, we know that emergency department visits for teens specifically increased, especially for girls, which as you know, in general, there's more suicide attempts by girls than boys in teens, and that boys tend to make a little bit more serious or fatal behaviors, right? And so there was an increase in attempts. 50% increase in 2021, right? Compared to the year before the pandemic, right? Comparing a year in the pandemic and a year afterwards. So we know there was some effect on some of these suicidal behaviors, the exact nature of the relationship. That's what we're going to try to tease out some, right? And so broadly, when we talk about suicidal behaviors, we know you've heard it many times on the news, you've read about it, but the increase in all these risk factors, right? But even so, there wasn't this predicted big jump in suicide deaths in 2020, right? Compared to the year before. And this was consistent with findings in several other countries, globally, right? That at least in the first part of this pandemic, where there was all these predictions, this didn't happen. We think from a more nuanced perspective that it's all a few other variables to take into account, right? And that we know the pandemic wasn't like a discrete event, right? It's a long, ongoing and process event that people have different phases of response to. But when you look here, when you look at the CDC data for youth suicides, again, 15 to 24 years old, we found that in general, in all states, if you combine the absolute number, there was an increase. That was mostly mediated by the increase in these 5 states that you see at the top, right? Georgia, Indiana, New Jersey, Oklahoma, and Virginia. And that in California, there was also an increase, but not compared to these other states. So that in general, for youngsters, there was an increase and during that same time period. And then now we're getting to what some of the factors, right? Over and over again, you heard, oh, the loneliness, the isolation, the issues that came as a result of the pandemic. What do we know about this, right? Well, in looking at all the science, right? We found that there's a clear association with loneliness and mental health problems in kids and children, adolescents. But in a certain way, we've kind of known that from the geriatric literature of the population. That's why when you look moving forward, when you talk about the aging population, you talk about building communities and social contact and not this isolation for individuals for their physical, emotional, and mental health in the elderly population. But the same is true for teens, right? And that we know that this subjective feeling of loneliness is also a predictor, a proxy for issues down the road, and even up to 9 years in a lot of the studies, right? And that the length of that feeling is a real predictor, right? And we know that a lot in our world, right? It's called the duration, or even sometimes the latency, the time from when you feel something to when you intervene, right? That the longer it is, generally the slower to resolve, or maybe even sometimes the harder it is to help someone, for someone to evolve out of it, right? But if you look at all the studies globally, United States and globally, we found that the strongest association with loneliness was with clinical depression. The relationship for anxiety, which I would have predicted would have been even more, was even higher, right? Was very modest, but it was there, but it just wasn't very as strong as depression. So yes, loneliness, the things that we've read and seen on TV, there is a lot of evidence demonstrating that there is a clear association with it. And that we know this even before the pandemic. It's not just pandemic related data and information. We did, at United Way of Broward County, I'm on the commission on, we changed the name, gosh, I should know that, the Commission on Mental Health and Drug Prevention. And so the United Way in Broward does a lot of wonderful work, community-based work on prevention. And so they were already getting the information, so then I just work with them to try to say, hey, maybe there's something to learn from it, right? Looking at these 360 teens, or I call them teens, but up to 21. And they were already involved in these youth programs, school-based, faith-based programs. And then we were doing all the needs assessment, right? Because the needs assessment was looking at surveying them, getting information back from them, both in a structured way, but also in a mixed methods, right? Kind of in an open way, and with the hopes of trying to inform future programs that United Way was to fund, right? And basically, even though I included these very specific tables afterwards, we're going to skip them, is that basically what we found was, look at that, over half of the kids admitted to feeling lonelier. But in contrast, nearly 2/3 said that, hey, but my relationships, the way my relationships were, the quality and the quantity of them kind of remained about the same. And about 3/4 said, but wait, I also have good support system, right? So you could see that these things are not necessarily connected, right? That it's a very individual and even subjective feeling, right? I could be around people and feel lonely. I could have support system, but still feel lonely, right? And that the other thing we found, obviously, is that we didn't see an increase in substance use or vaping as well. Now, this was very cross-sectional, and this was towards the beginning of the pandemic, around May, June 2020, about 4 months after that, right after the kids finished that first wonderful semester, that first wonderful year of school. But it just goes to show how complicated these things are, right? And how these issues are not just points in time. It's complicated by the individual responses. It's complicated by the varying responses over time and by multiple other factors, including, as you know, the environmental factors, exposure to media and other things like that. So I'm going to skip these as we get into couple other issues, but it's just to highlight how this is really, really complex and complicated and not, I stay away from reductionism, right? Oh, trying to explain everything by one fact, but it's all because of this rather than multiple factors, right? Briefly, then Kate allowed me to kind of present a little bit of a model there without getting too technical, right? But the first is Joyner's model of remember, part of it is understanding behaviors and trying to help. As you can't just go on a symptom or a behavior. You want to try to understand mechanisms and how come, right? I never use the why, but the how come, or the factors involved and how people end up taking their lives or thinking about it, etc., because that forms the basis of trying to see how to prevent and how to help individuals, right? So one is Joyner's model, right? Kind of based on these three factors, right? Where people feel very isolated. And the more you feel alone, the more you're going to say, hey, you know, I'm going to be more negative. The more a feeling of burdensomeness, as you see there in the top right circle, right? And then the bottom one is the kind of the facilitator, right? That I'm not afraid to die, so therefore blank, right? And remember, we're two concepts, right? That I'm not afraid of death and I'm not afraid to die, right? And they are different, right? But the one I'm going to try to kind of focus a little bit more on is the IMV model, right? The integrated motivational volitional model. I know it's 6 o'clock. What is it? 6:18 on Wednesday. And I know this is a lot of boxes and things, but just to kind of reduce it is to show that there's our phases and that our efforts are targeted differently at different phases. And so the rectangle on the far left of your screen is the pre-motivational phase. And that's kind of where you put a lot of your prevention efforts, right? Diathesis means predisposition. So my early work, we talked about exposures to TV movies and fictional and non-fictional coverage. And what that means is that just like with video games with kids, is that you could be exposed to something and it could affect you one way, but if you're predisposed, it's going to affect you differently. So what does that mean? That means individuals with pre-existing issues such as depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, substance use disorders, etc., get affected differently if you're exposed to something else. And therefore, the risk increases. Whatever that means, it doesn't mean it's more complicated than actually saying you're going to do something, right? But that interacts with your environment, your school, the home, the peers, and then all the life events that one experiences. Call them what you want: trauma, adverse childhood experiences, SLEs, serious life events, right? That really impact one. And it's a loop, right? Because it affects your predisposition or your diathesis, right? If you've been exposed to a traumatic event, if you've been a victim of trauma, if you've experienced or lived it, it not only affects you, but it changes how you deal things, see things, and makes increases some of your an individual's vulnerabilities. So therefore, you'll see in a minute, we talk about, well, you're going to see that the prevention strategies are targeted. Well, then we want to have safe environments. We want people to get treatment or identify issues early, things like that. So it's all tied in. So you can see, we don't just start with this second phase. We go, you need to come in with certain things. Youth brings certain things in. And then when things happen, right? Like, hey, and usually they're interpersonal, right? Oh, there's this humiliation at school or interpersonally or in my team or in my group, etc. And I feel defeated, right? That's a real issue, right? And what kind of mediates whether that grows or not, or it's the bottom box there, right? How well your problem solving, your social skills, your social problem solving skills, conflict resolution skills, generally coping skills, how healthy they are and how well they can be protective for things not moving forward, right? Now, on the flip side is all this ruminative, we call it ruminative biases, but it's also some getting stuck on things, negative attributions. Remember, an attribution is where you have something that's unclear and you give it your meaning, right? So if you're depressed, you tend to see things much more negatively, even though if it's not sure, oh, they're doing this to me, oh, they don't like me, whereas in reality you may not really know, right? And so if those positive characteristics are not there, it leads to feeling like, oh my gosh, entrapment, right? Where do I go? Remember? Some people call it hopelessness, right? I feel like there's no way out at all, right? And that's a process, right? So interventions can happen along the way in different spheres, including socially, right? And then what happens is like, oh my gosh, then you really get into like, uh-oh, if you feel that bad, that's when the social supports are even more important, right? And needed to be put in place, right? You shouldn't be alone. You should feel supported. You should feel understood. You should feel heard in the process. And just like joiners, you shouldn't feel like, oh my gosh, I don't want to say anything because I'm going to be a burden. I'm putting this on you, and say, no, a true friend, a true family member really does want to hear and help along the way, right? That's part of the social intervention that hopefully is there. Or if not, then you start getting to expression of more clinical things like the thinking and the intention, and ultimately leading to that last rectangle of the actual behaviors, right? And that's where, if you're already in that place, that's where things that are availability of firearms, right? Availability of firearms is less of an issue at the far left, right? But if you're feeling humiliated, trapped, hopeless, if you're isolated, and the scenario is you have access to firearms or some other lethal method, right? It creates a mix of the likelihood of the expression of actually doing something, right? Then you mix that with impulsivities at the bottom right, but it's really a diathesis, right? Because we know if you look at the typologies or how suicide's classified with youth, it tends to be more impulsivity than with the elderly, because if you remember that first graph, 85 years and above have the highest suicide rates in this country. The teens tend to be more impulsive than the elderly, where it's more thought out and life is lived and they see less reason, or they have a longer runway, shorter runway than the youth. And so that impulsivity is a real factor, whether it's a diathesis, a predisposition, or whether it's an actual behavior in the moment that really kind of has things click through. And that's historically why at the emergency department at Jackson for 18 years, we would see the kids hours later and they would go, what? That was a couple hours ago. Now I'm not so upset, not so impulsive, almost like everything's fine. I go, really? 3 hours and go blank, right? Because their emotions were less, they were less impulsive. They didn't have those we call cognitive distortions, the changes in thinking that you get when you're really upset as a youngster, right? And remember, I mean, there's a strong emotion and your thinking changes. Individuals think and consider and do things that they typically wouldn't do when they're calmer. And you put those means and other things available there, and then you're more likely to act on it. And if it's not lethal, or if there's someone around to intervene, when the emotions calm down, hopefully that individual's risk comes down some, but that hopefully they haven't done something more serious. We'll get back to this briefly, right? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just to understand that some of this needs to come from something, right? It's not just, I thought this up, or someone thinks we should do these things. Basic preventive strategies. If you look at the World Health Organization globally, it's restricting access to means. If you go outside of the US, if you look at the method most commonly employed, it is not firearms, it is pesticides, right? And that's because if you look a lot around the globe, there's less access to firearms, and a lot of lower socioeconomic countries that are primarily agriculturally based, and there's much more access to pesticides, right? So restricting access to pesticides become an issue globally. Here in the US, you hear the issues about firearm, and not just on the violence and homicide side, but also as methods of trying to prevent suicides. And so then we're not going to get into that debate that goes beyond today's scope, because in general, if you take it as an isolated issue, you go, okay, but you could see when you have vulnerable individuals and you have individuals that have access to these means, then all these issues align like we just discussed, it becomes a real issue. And actually, if you look at some of the literature, it's also a little bit not so important whether they're handguns, short arms, or long arms, right? In the sense of the use in suicide deaths. But we know it's more complicated. So if you go back to the front end, what we call the diathesis part, and that whole rectangle, I keep calling them boxes, right? But it was a rectangle. You go, yes, you need to deal with some of these social determinants of health and in life, right? You know, people need financial security, right? And that helps the family in general, and right? And then housing, right? Secure housing, another social determinant. It all helps the quality of the family life, and in general, it's protective, right? It's steps removed, but it is protective as well for a lot of things, not just suicide, right? This you all know and love, right? Is well, then we need to improve access, not only to care, but once there is available care, it isn't just care, it's the quality of the care and the type of care available, right? And how do you do that? With a lot of things. One is to talk about coverage and access, or if not coverage, having access to it, right? Shortage in access with providers. We've seen that in the pandemic. You all are part of that, and people over and over again getting appointments with individuals is much harder these days. And then how to, once individuals get their appointments, how to provide this very unique care to the youth and their families, right? So that it's very youth-centric or family-centric youth. So remember, just attending is not enough, right? So attendance is a proxy for engagement, and engagement is a proxy for improvement, right? So just showing up is one very crude measure, but it doesn't mean the appropriate things are happening or that things will change. It's much more complicated than that. And then next we talk about the environments, right? Yes, you've seen it, right? You need to have policies, even laws to look at these lethal access to means, right? We're not talking about the aggression side. That's a whole nother discussion, right? But we know it's pretty clear on the suicide, related to suicide in youth about firearms, right? And it needs to be not only from a public health perspective, but different organizations and the culture in general, right? And then along with that, aside from mental health issues and substance use treatment is again, access to things like alcohol, right? And so that's why many prevention programs target, take your pick, spring break, underage drinking or access to drinking, right? Because we know that one is substance use disorders, but we know that intoxication is very much that right-hand box issue, that if you're predisposed, if you're feeling trapped, if you're feeling lonely, if you're feeling without hope, you have access to a mean, and you're intoxicated. Maybe the individual doesn't use on a regular basis. It creates a higher risk because of changes in thinking and feelings and emotion and impulsivity and disinhibition. So looking at these formal or informal condoning underage drinking in the general population is one thing, and certain individuals at risk is another issue. So it's a real issue in this country, because if you look at it, the number one misused substance is that, and followed by cannabis, right? So well, drinking's an issue, underage drinking's an issue. This goes to more individual strategies, and you saw that, right? And that's middle box, if you will, about problem solving, conflict resolution, and other coping strategies. That no matter how bad I feel, suicide should never be an option. And how do you help youngsters say not only what are the alternatives, but how can I make it happen, right? Remember, one is a thought process, a cognitive, and one's an action. It's a skill, right? So it really takes work. And if you know teens, again, what I talked about attendance and engagement, it isn't just like, I promise I won't do that. I promise I went to my appointments. It really takes a certain amount of engagement and motivation. If the teen isn't engaged or motivated, you have to go back a couple steps to work on maybe motivational interviewing or something like that, but to help move that dial a little bit, right? But either way, if that's not happening, then you work on engaging the family or the parent and how to help. Not only help the teen, but help within the family as well, because it's many times complicated, right? And so, yes, the parental and family interventions are just as important as the individual interventions in general. Nothing new there, right? You all know that, right? And then suicide, it becomes even more important. Kind of some of the work we're doing is working with the primary care providers to look at what can be done there. Individuals or teens really trust that kids, they do, but especially parents trust their pediatricians. They don't want to come to the psychiatrist necessarily unless they quote unquote really need to, but they really trust their pediatricians in general. And so therefore working in the primary care setting has become much more of a focus over the last several years, not only as gatekeepers, but as first line of individuals that can prevent and intervene, etc. And it's become much more clear than, let's say, 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? Needless to say, treatment, it's not really prevention, right? But treatment and treatment of at risk and people who have made an attempt is important, right? Again, not prevention, but important. So, and then we've talked way back about words matter and how things get reported and message and how to use individual-centric words and not all these stigmatizing words that could maybe interfere with one's ability to not only acknowledge an issue, but also accept the need to take a step and get help. It's important to feel safe reporting, messaging, that there is a need to report, right? Because obviously, and some of you have heard me say before, if you don't report, if you don't count it, how can you measure it? If you can't measure it, how can you fund it, right? So these things are all important, right? As opposed to, no, we're not going to say that the pediatrician or the ED, or that we're not going to let others know because of the stigma, the taboo, and other things. But it's really all part of that, right? Because that's what's really needed in the bigger picture, on multiple levels, right? As I said, from the individual to the large public health policy funding levels, right? Of being able to message it. And so, yes, as recent as 2 weeks ago, telling the students, no, you don't commit suicide. You would think that even though they've gotten that several times in their education, it's like, gosh, you have to be more aware of that and look at these stigmatizing terms, because it's not only you, but it's the others, and each individual is an ambassador on this. So really, it's the messaging about it that's important. And here we go, folks. This is like one of those Netflix movies. We're kind of building up to it, like, oh, the first half was kind of wrong, but whatever. We're building up to the second part where we're talking about connectedness, right? Take your pick of how you want to do it. Moving from the focus on loneliness to really moving to then the flip side of that is, how do we have people feel connected and be connected in this world? And then this is where this whole debate came in over throughout the pandemic, right? Well, the youngsters were still connected vis-a-vis these online platforms. What's the problem? You may not see each individual face-to-face, IRL, right? But you're connected to them still. What's the difference? Well, that seemed to help for a while. And subjectively, it seemed to be okay, but as it dragged on, there was a lot of reports from the teens about how it just wasn't enough, that it was okay transitionally. A bunch of them reported about how they were also struggling with the lack of finite with it. It's this whole binary. Is it beginning and an end versus, no, this is continuing, and therefore, then not feeling as satisfied with these being connected and interacting with these online platforms. So it's complex, right? Because time is an issue, individual coping is an issue, perception is an issue, and other environmental restrictions, right? As we've had different levels of quote unquote lockdown. But guess what? If you go back and look, in 2011, actually the CDC really officially announced and adopted that, hey, preventing suicidal behavior, connectedness is an important factor, and we need to include that. This is not just a pandemic-related issue. We know that loneliness is a risk, right, for teens, and as I said, for individuals in general, and that this was already kind of there. It just created a different layer of how to handle these things that no one really anticipated, if you will. And you see the definition there, right? That it's really the subjective experience or feeling of how, the degree of how one feels it's connected, closely related, or sharing with others. So again, it's what I may perceive, another may perceive differently, and it's not a hard and fast thing, right? So it really depends on the individual. And yeah, you know, the different layers, right? It could be peers, like kids, youth with youth, right? Or schools, or team member, neighbors, right? In the pandemic, some of it was neighbors as well. Need to say family members. You saw in our small study that they felt just as connected or supported, was the word we used, by their family members. So it didn't quite make sense, even though they were feeling fairly lonely, but they still felt that they were part of, right? Or to bigger organizations, right? And some of it could be the actual peers in the school or just fidelity to the school. Yes, I identify to the school versus I identify with these group of kids in the school. And certainly the faith-based communities, because we saw how protected that was over the pandemic as well, right? And then other minority and underrepresented groups, LGBTQ or other minority groups and individuals who kind of look and say, hey, I feel connected to my own group instead of the larger group, my Hispanic group, my Asian group, my other groups, and therefore that's protected, right? It's identification, it's support, and it's connectedness. And we know connectedness is a complicated construct, right? So there's layers, right? On the other hand, how can adults help, right? So yes, it isn't just the youth promoting, it isn't just working directly with youth, right? Okay, let's have these programs, let's have these groups, and let's have the youth kind of work together on not only bringing them together, but also work on these coping strategies. It's how each adult can work on developing these positive relationships. Again, nothing new, but much more important and within the context of the pandemic and with suicidal behaviors. So that's an important variable, right? And that it's not just the relationships, but it's talk about the connection. Another word would be attachment, right? The feeling of belongingness and identification with, and especially with what we call pro-social organizations, not gangs, right? And not other groups. It's super important, right? Not new, but again, very much highlighted by the pandemic. And knowing that online platforms was able to move that dial some, but it seemed to peak and plateau with certain groups, its effectiveness, right? And actually, anecdotally, if you go around in here, when things started opening up, there was kind of this rebound where all these kids were going out and doing things, and it's almost like the out of jail phenomena, where they would kind of let themselves go after a period of being isolated and sequestered. And yeah, peer delivered services is an important tool, vehicle, intervention to help individuals, right? It doesn't have to be vertical. It could be facilitated by adults, but the real process of change can happen with peers, right? And really schools and other really where the kids spend their day, and it should be a vehicle for that, right? Even with the whole debate of what the functions of school is, there's been a movement to incorporating more, which I think still not quite adequate, mental health services in school, right? To help improve those networks and connection. And why? Is that a place? Sure, but other limitations? Sure, because we know there's summers and there's breaks, right? And the pandemics taught us that, right? That it can't be only schools, it has to be other organizations, other programs as well. Now, here's where we get to the but wait, right? So did you know that connectedness, and there's a whole bunch of literature that it's not all positive. No, 3 no's. It's like, oh, everybody needs to be connected, It's like, wait a minute. Remember that not all those connections are healthy, right? And one of them we know is where these online relationships take a certain life of their own. And for a group of individuals, I don't know how small, right? It becomes unhealthy, and it becomes a proxy for in real life relationships. And then it becomes a whole struggle. I give you anecdotes of excessiveness and the struggle with the parents, that you're online the whole time, and then the kids in this kind of catastrophic way say, oh my God, but they're the only people in the whole world, and I never. And what it really is a struggle with multiple layers. But if it's a replacement for versus a complementary way of engaging and connecting with individuals. It creates different dynamics and probably different outcomes, and it's a function of different processes, right? Creates these struggles as well. And then we also know there is this emerging literature about how connectedness is a little bit associated, and luckily these youth suicide clusters are not that common, but they do occur. And they tend to occur in these settings, like in these school settings where people are very, very connected and they're very, very homogenous. So when there's one suicide death by a teen, then it kind of leads to others. Now, way back, we used to think that was a function of a few different things, right? One is that the more direct the exposure was with that teen, the more likely they would be at risk. But two, that none of this would be as important if they didn't present this predisposition to that, right? The diathesis, that is, they came in with these pre-existing issues. Three is not only how close, but how much they identified, and some of that is why it's homogeneous, both in appearances and in culture and in looks and in behaviors, that the more likely it's going to affect them, or how idealized that individual was, right? And we know that from some of the celebrity work as well. So connectedness can have a negative side as well for certain subgroups. But in general, obviously, it has much more positive than negative, without a doubt. So I'm a big advocate for that, right? Because yes, that this in the purple box, right, was yes, it's strong connections from likely to lead to better outcomes in a lot of ways. And we should be promoting it. We should be careful with certain subgroups of individuals. That should be the message, right? So it's not so categorical, all or none, all good, not so binary, right? So back to here, right? So, oh my gosh, so social issues, connectedness come up in all phases of things, right? And our understanding of suicidal behaviors and where we could intervene. Really at the back end, the far right, oh my gosh, it's really important about a youth who's exhibiting these suicidal behaviors and should not be alone. No, 3 no's, right? And obviously all these other variables you see down there, and then you get rid of the firearms or remove the access, and then you take care of environmental things, and then you work on other safety issues, whether it's hospitalization or not, right? To more, to different phases in the process you can see there. And I was just trying to put it in red circles to kind of illustrate where the social and the support and the quote unquote, the attempts to decrease this subjective feeling of isolation, right? Keeping in mind that if someone is either very negative, depressed, or in such a negative headspace that no matter what you say, they're still going to be in those loops, but the presence of that support is still valuable in both the short run and obviously more distally down in the long run. So I won't kind of harp on this, but just that there's different places in the process of in the evolution of suicidal behaviors where social support, social interventions, enhancing the feeling of belonging, connectedness, attachment can be very, very protective, right? Yet we still have much work to do in understanding this and being able to refine this and to consider whether from more universal interventions, universal programs, to much more targeted interventions to individuals that are more at risk, to kind of, when you talk about this era where resources and money is very, very finite. And as we understand better this whole process of the pandemic, right? We're still in the works of trying to tease it out so we can learn from it. And we can try to evolve how we intervene and try to look at this complex interaction of social connectedness, right? Which we knew from before, right? And how these social factors affect the risk for suicide. And then figure out this very complex interaction with things like the environment and the pandemic. And so on that note, I thank you for the opportunity, right? And I'm open to any thoughts anyone may have and any comments.
I actually had a question for you, Dr. Castellanos. One of the things that I've been hearing about is the idea of therapy in virtual reality. And I was wondering if you had read any literature or if you had any thoughts about it, especially given, you know, that concept of connectedness. You know, is this something that could potentially be a helpful tool, especially if someone's feeling suicidal and they can just pop something on and be with somebody, or, you know, could this potentially further isolate us? I was just wondering, because
Well, let me say
hearing a little bit about it.
There's been a lot of benefits from telehealth, right? And the rapid pivot. There's maybe over promise in certain ways, but it's been around, right? The VA has some wonderful, wonderful apps and technology, even before all this, to help people feel connected, either whether it's craving, substance use, or crises, and they would connect you directly to someone for that real-time intervention, right? There's a lot of positives because it provides greater access, right? That we know, and it provides the ability to begin interventions sooner. On the other hand, our science is behind, right? So there was some emerging literature that if you do this kind of therapy in person, is it going to be exactly the same if you do it through telehealth, right? And although it may sound intuitive, it's not always that. Like Dr. Fauci said, it may make sense, but it doesn't necessarily, it isn't necessarily supportive. And so I think a little bit of the jury's still out, because I do think most of it does kind of replicate. But yes, doing cognitive behavioral therapy in person, there's some work saying it can really work through telehealth. Can other therapies be beneficial? We're not sure. And then two is that a lot of individuals haven't, not that you have to, right? But there's certain telehealth competencies that we think each clinician should have as a foundation in providing it. And that's just what we call standard of care, right? But that's very hard to monitor these things over time. So that becomes a little bit of a quality issue. So I view it as very promising, but again, I view it as a way to go of how to improve things.
Someone had asked me, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, if you were able to share your PowerPoint, if you were able to give that to some of the viewers today.
I can can I send it to you afterwards?
I will distribute it, not
Yes.
a problem.
So, and I didn't put, I mean, I take my work seriously. Sometimes I'll put some light humor as bridge slides, and I didn't put any of that, so I can just PDF it and send it to you. It'll
Okay.
send PowerPoint, sorry. So yes,
Perfect.
absolutely.
Oh, that works great. And then someone asked what you think about for the use of apps for day-to-day monitoring of mood. Excuse me.
So I
the
think
day-to-day
absolutely.
Monitoring of mood.
Yes, I saw that pop up. Even without my glasses, right? I think all that's great. I think that's great. It's mediated by the use of it, right? So yes, if I begin, it's like me, I don't exercise, but if I begin and I drop off, it's one thing. But yes, it is, and it's more complicated than that, right? Because it's not only the feedback, there are many other apps that can provide constructive things if you start going below on your mood and there's changes, and that it moves from monitoring to helping some type of interventions. So I think that there's a lot of okay apps out there that can really help as a tool. Again, it's mediated by one being engaged and doing at that. But if I was discussing with somebody, if you're the kind of person that monitors your steps and stuff, I don't have an Apple Watch or anything, but and that you use that feedback to continue your behaviors and continue to work on it, I think apps work very well for individuals like that really are engaged in entering it and then engaged in utilizing that for behavior change.
I was also wondering, one of the things I hear a lot about are trying to help youth or even adults who don't have coping mechanisms when it comes to emotional regulation and You know, I've talked to some individuals through our helpline who seem very lost when it comes to, you know, I know we focused on youth, but the truth is they are adults and they're looking to basically adapt and to grow these coping mechanisms, for lack of a better word. I was wondering if you had any advice, because obviously, you know, therapy is a good option, but sometimes there's some resistance.
Yeah, I know that. And, you know, now here's my joke, right? There's only two types of people. There's kids and big kids, right? So some of the big kids still do the same things, right? But if you look at the typology, I'm going to focus on the kids. It's really is this youngster comes in with this predisposition. There's a trigger. The great majority of the times, those triggers, it's not a cause, a trigger, a stressor is interpersonal. It could be horizontal, peers, girlfriend, boyfriend, friends, or vertical, mom, dad, teacher, police. And then it triggers a strong emotion, right? I said it, it's like getting upset real fast, right? Doesn't give you time to think and cope, right? And then that strong emotion leads to this changes in thinking, the cognitive distortions. When you get really upset, you think and do things. And that's the risk period, right? Like, I can't believe it. What are the four most common, we call them attributions, is, and the most common one is that my life is so bad, suicide becomes an option in that moment. The attribution is, it's an escape from this intolerable situation in the moment, right? The second one is retribution or retaliation. Oh yeah, I'm going to get back at so-and-so by killing myself. The third is atonement. That's usually associated with like a lot of guilt, like, oh, I should have gone to see grandma, abuela before. How could I? I was out dancing. I should have gone, right? And the fourth is reunification, right? Oh, I want to be in heaven. Remember, these are the changes that come. I want to die. I'm going to take my life. I'm going to kill myself because I want to be in heaven with so-and-so who died, right? And then if you can get through that wave, either by you working through it, coping skill, or external, then the thinking comes back to more linear, regular, right? But that's a big risk period if you're impulsive. So then the work is like, hey, take your pick. How do you work on the diaphysis? If you're depressed, if you have all these issues, if you're using substances, if you have impulsivity, how do you work on identifying triggers or stresses so you can avoid them or be aware? How do you, if they do happen, how do you help yourself stop going off so fast, right? That rise, it's really hard once you're in it to change the thinking. I always say it's like the child with the terrible twos. Once they're in it, you can't get them to stop. You jangle the keys or you got to walk outside with them or something, right? Until the wave passes. So there are ways to do it, but it really has to be a lot of steps, because you can use environmental things, but the person needs to be able to kind of make these connections inside, right? And yeah, you can call it whatever you want. That's why people call it anger management, right? Which there is no such like real therapy, but it helps like make it less threatening at times, right?
I think we had one other question about minimizing the impacts of triggers in our youth.
That's a statement.
Sorry, how can we minimize the impact of triggers in our youth?
I see. I wish I had a good answer for that, right? Because remember, and that's a good word, minimize, because we talk about management and not eliminating of these things, right? And when you talk about minimizing the impact, then you have to break it down on different levels. And one is individual coping, right? No matter what the trigger is, I'm going to manage it. I've evolved my coping strategies. I'm doing this and that. And the other one is more like strategic, I call it, and say, oh, I know if I go here and do this, this is gonna, so I'm going to avoid, or if I start this in a conversation, I'm going to work on disengaging, which is part of a coping strategy, so that it doesn't escalate, because I know the trigger is this and this. So I wish I had a good, clear answer, right? Because yeah, it'd be good to one reflect and one be able to develop that either on oneself or with the help of others. But I can tell you at 16, 17, I was not that person, right? And I don't think I would have been as enlightened. And then the other is you work with these kind of more external things, but it comes back to a lot of it has to start with the individual, which I think is where I wish I had a better answer on.
Thank you very much. If there are no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and put some information in the chat. In his presentation, Dr. Castellanos mentioned becoming a gatekeeper, which is actually perfect because the QPR that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation actually teaches you how to become a gatekeeper, learning how to recognize those warning signs of suicide, and also teaching you how to, like Dr. Castellanos mentioned, use the right language when speaking to someone, having the right attitude when approaching someone that you may think might be having suicidal ideation. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat. If anyone else has any questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. No, I'm sure we can email him afterwards if you really have burning questions. But here in the chat, this is the family to family link. Specifically for the course that we have coming up on the 12th. So if anyone would like to register, please go ahead online. We'll be looking to support those family members who have a loved one who are looking to learn more about mental health conditions. And then the link to the QPR class that is happening this Saturday. So that's the 10th. It's about an hour and a half long. And we have many of these presentations coming up, the suicide prevention trainings. You do get a certificate of attendance. And I'd like to thank you again, Dr. Castellanos, for all of this amazing information, especially for those of us that work in the field. We do hear so much, I think, about the suicides that happen in our community. And, you know, the more of us that are educated, the better. So I really appreciate you joining us tonight and for all the hard work that you do to help educate on this topic.
And I really appreciate the opportunity and everything that you do and NAMI does. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So everyone have a great evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed this presentation and that you got something from it. And stay tuned for more information. We'll be sending out more information on QPR moving forward. So thank you all very much. Have a great night.